in 1957, Khrushchev started something called the Brezhnev Committee, which met to revise Soviet strategy for the nuclear age. Here you had Sputnik, you had hydrogen bombs. How are you going to do it? They came up with the idea of faking the collapse of the Soviet Union at some time in the distant future. It was part of a 40-year long-range strategy that they came up with, and it had two completely different elements to it. It had a nuclear war element to exploit the disarmament of the West, but it had a collapse of communism element. We know this from other defectors. This defector, Anatoly Golitsyn, was a major in the KGB. He started out in counterintelligence. He moved over. He ended up becoming, I think, the deputy resident of the Soviet embassy in Finland, from where he defected in 1961. This is a quote from Golitsyn's book, New Lies for Old. This is a very important book. It was published, it was actually written before Gorbachev and actually written before Brezhnev died. So he's writing at the height of the Cold War, and he says, if in a reasonable time liberalization can be successfully achieved in Poland and elsewhere, and he's talking about a fake liberalization, a controlled liberalization in Eastern Europe, it will serve to revitalize the communist regimes concerned. The activities of false opposition, that is, in the communist world, they create false opposition groups, which the KGB controls. So the activities of false opposition will further confuse and undermine the genuine opposition in the communist world. Externally, the role of dissidents will be to persuade the West that the liberalization is spontaneous and not controlled. Liberalization will create conditions for establishing solidarity between trade unions and intellectuals in the communist and non-communist worlds. In time, such alliances will generate new forms of pressure against Western militarism in favor of disarmament. Remember, the whole strategy is disarmament. How do you get the West to disarm? While you're not disarming, you pretend to surrender. You pretend to fake the collapse of communism. Again, Golitsyn continued, if liberalization is successful and accepted in the West as genuine, it may well be followed by the apparent withdrawal of one or more communist countries from the Warsaw Pact. Now this is prophetic. He goes on, the suggested European option would be promoted by a revival of controlled democratization on the Czechoslovak pattern in Eastern Europe, including probably Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. The intensification of hardline policies and methods in the Soviet Union presages a switch to democratization following perhaps Brezhnev's departure from the political scene. Now get this, Brezhnev's successor may well appear to be a kind of Soviet Dubček. Now if you remember the Czech Spring in 1968, Dubček was a liberalizing Czech. That was an experiment that the Russians conducted to see if they could have a controlled liberalization in one of the bloc countries. And of course, famously, the Soviet army came in and crushed it. But that experiment told them what they could do, if they could control it, and how it would work. That was a dress rehearsal for what they had in mind for Eastern Europe. Golitsyn continued, the liberalization would be spectacular and impressive. Formal pronouncements might be made about a reduction in the Communist Party's role. Its monopoly would be apparently curtailed. An ostensible separation of powers between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary might be introduced. The Supreme Soviet would be given greater apparent independence. The posts of President of the Soviet Union and First Secretary of the Party might well be separated. The KGB would be reformed. Dissidents at home would be amnestied, and those in exile abroad would be allowed to return, and some would take up positions of leadership. Now, it's very important in this context that Golitsyn's book contains, Mark Riebling, who wrote the book Wedge, was a scholar who went through Golitsyn's book and he found 140 falsifiable predictions. And that by 1992, almost 94% of those predictions had come true. And more have come true since then. And I'll discuss this again. Now, Jan Sejna, as if no other defector had mentioned this faking the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern Bloc alliance, Jan Sejna was one of several of the top communist leaders in communist Czechoslovakia. And he wrote this book in 1982, We Will Bury You. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, the erosion of NATO begun in phase 2 of the long-range strategy would be completed by the withdrawal of the United States from its commitment to the defense of Europe, and by European hostility to military expenditure generated by economic recession. To this end, we envisaged that it might be necessary to dissolve the Warsaw Pact, right? That's what they did. In which event, we had already prepared a web of bilateral defense arrangements to be supervised by secret committees of Comecon. That is astonishing. You've got two defectors both saying they're going to fake the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, their Eastern European alliance.